The hardest thing to throw away was never the food. It was the feeling that someone might see you reaching for it. Rain tapped softly against the brick wall behind the Whole Foods on Chicago's north side, turning the narrow service alley into a ribbon of shimmering reflections beneath the security lights. The delivery trucks had long since disappeared. The employees had gone home, and only the steady hum of refrigeration units broke the silence of the cold October night. Naomi Brooks waited in the shadows until the back door clicked shut for the final time. She counted slowly to 30, the same ritual she had repeated more nights than she cared to remember, then pulled the hood of her faded sweatshirt a little farther over her curls before stepping toward the row of locked dumpsters. Her fingers were stiff from the 43-degree air as she slipped a worn pair of work gloves over her hands. She moved carefully, quietly, almost respectfully, as though apologizing to the night itself for being there. Naomi was not searching for treasure. She was searching for tomorrow's breakfast. Earlier that afternoon, she had stood in her tiny apartment kitchen studying the nearly empty refrigerator while her 6-year-old son, Micah, sat at the table coloring rockets on the back of an old grocery receipt. He had smiled when she served him the last bowl of oatmeal, pretending not to notice she wasn't eating. She had told him she already had lunch at work. That had been a lie. It was easier to skip a meal than to let a child carry the weight of adult worries. Tonight, there was exactly $12.16 in her checking account. Rent was already 5 days overdue. Her electric bill sat unopened beneath a magnet shaped like a sunflower because she already knew what it would say. Micah's asthma inhaler needed a refill before Friday. Her housekeeping shift at the hotel had been cut by 6 hours this week after occupancy dropped, and the grocery delivery app barely covered enough gas to keep her aging Honda moving. One missing paycheck had become two. Two had become an avalanche she could no longer outrun. She lifted the heavy lid just enough to peer inside. Cardboard. Produced boxes. Bags tied neatly with green drawstrings. She searched with practiced care, ignoring anything torn open or questionable. Her grandmother had once told her that dignity wasn't about what you had. It was about how gently you carried yourself when life tried to take everything away. Naomi still believed that, even here. Then she saw it. A small container of organic vanilla yogurt resting inside a clean cardboard-produced tray, still sealed, the expiration date only 1 day behind. She picked it up carefully and wiped a few drops of rainwater from the plastic lid with the sleeve of her sweatshirt. A tiny smile crossed her face before she could stop it. Micah loved vanilla yogurt. He always scraped the cup clean with the little blue spoon she had bought at a yard sale years ago, because he insisted food somehow tasted better with that spoon. Naomi turned the container over twice, reading every word printed on it, as though hoping the date might magically change. 1 day, just 1 day, she whispered, "You'll be okay," though she wasn't sure whether she was speaking to the yogurt or to herself. 3 floors above the alley, warm light spilled across polished hardwood floors inside the executive office overlooking the flagship store. Elijah Carter stood alone beside the floor-to-ceiling windows, his loosened tie hanging unevenly after another 14-hour day filled with meetings, forecasts, and conversations about margins measured in fractions of percentages. He had been staring absent-mindedly at the rain when movement below caught his attention. At first, he assumed it was an employee finishing late. Then he saw the woman standing behind the dumpsters. He watched her freeze for a heartbeat after lifting the lid, glancing over each shoulder with the quiet instinct of someone expecting shame before kindness. Yet what unsettled him wasn't that she searched through discarded groceries. It was the extraordinary care with which she held that single yogurt cup afterward, brushing invisible dirt away as though someone precious had handed it to her. There was no greed in the gesture, no desperation that looked wild or reckless, only exhaustion wrapped around determination. Elijah found himself stepping closer to the glass without realizing it. The city below continued moving as always, traffic lights blinking, buses passing, distant sirens fading into the night. But the woman in the alley seemed to exist outside all of it. She slipped the yogurt gently into a reusable tote bag, adjusted the frayed strap on her shoulder, and looked up for the briefest second. Her eyes never reached his window. They lingered instead on the bright green Whole Foods sign glowing against the rain before she quietly disappeared into the darkness beyond the parking lot, carrying something most people inside the store would have thrown away without a second thought. Elijah remained standing at the window long after she was gone. Unable to explain why a container of yogurt no longer worth selling suddenly felt heavier than every quarterly report waiting on the desk behind him. Morning arrived with the pale gray light of another overcast Chicago day, filtering through thin apartment curtains that had faded after years of washing. Naomi Brooks woke before the alarm because she had trained herself never to waste a single quiet minute before responsibility filled every corner of the day. She slipped carefully from the worn sofa bed without waking Micah, whose small hand still rested on the blue spoon lying beside his favorite cereal bowl after he had insisted on keeping it close the night before. She smiled despite the heaviness in her chest, opened the refrigerator, and took out the yogurt she had carried home through the rain. She examined the date one more time before peeling back the lid. It smelled perfectly normal. She stirred it gently, divided it into 2 small bowls, then quietly slid the larger portion in front of Micah when he wandered into the kitchen rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Vanilla," he whispered with genuine excitement, climbing onto his chair. "My favorite." Naomi brushed a curl away from his forehead. "Eat slowly," she said with a warm smile. "You have school today, and astronauts need energy." Micah grinned. "I am going to build rockets one day, Mom." "I know you will." She watched him enjoy every spoonful before pretending to sip coffee that contained nothing but hot water and the last trace of yesterday's grounds. He never noticed because he was busy explaining how astronauts probably missed their mothers when they traveled through space. After walking him to the neighborhood elementary school, Naomi headed across town on the elevated train, already calculating the hours ahead. For hotel rooms before noon, grocery deliveries until late afternoon, then another cleaning shift at a downtown office building if the supervisor called. Every dollar already had a destination before it reached her account. Rent, utilities, gasoline, Micah's inhaler, laundry. There was never enough left for uncertainty. At the Lakeshore Grand Hotel, she tied on a housekeeping apron and pushed her supply cart down a hallway lined with polished brass fixtures and thick blue carpet that softened every footstep. Room after room looked almost identical, yet each one reminded her how differently people lived. Half-eaten breakfasts rested untouched on room service trays. Bottles of expensive mineral water remained unopened. Fresh towels lay folded exactly as they had been delivered. Naomi never judged the guests. She simply wondered what it felt like to stop thinking about the price of every ordinary decision. As she stripped the sheets from one king-size bed, something slid onto the mattress with a soft thump. A leather wallet. She opened it only far enough to identify the owner before freezing at the sight of several crisp $100 bills. There was enough cash inside to pay nearly 2 months of rent. For one impossible heartbeat, she imagined what life would look like if no one ever came back for it. Micah would have fresh groceries. The electric bill would disappear. The overdue notice taped inside her kitchen cabinet could finally be thrown away. Then she closed the wallet, carried it directly to the front desk, and asked the manager to contact the guest immediately. "You did not even count the money?" the receptionist asked with quiet surprise. Naomi shook her head. "It belongs to someone else." The manager thanked her and mentioned there might be a reward if the guest wished to offer one. Naomi smiled politely. "If he asks who found it, you do not have to tell him. Just let him know it made it back." By early afternoon, her feet ached inside shoes whose soles had been repaired twice with adhesive. She accepted 3 grocery delivery orders before discovering that one customer lived almost 12 miles outside her usual route. The extra mileage barely covered the gasoline, but declining the order would lower her acceptance rating. She accepted anyway. At a red light, her phone buzzed with a notification from the landlord reminding her that formal eviction paperwork could begin if payment was not received within 72 hours. Naomi closed her eyes for a brief second before the traffic moved again. She whispered the same promise she made every morning. "Just make it to tomorrow." Somewhere across the city, Elijah Carter sat inside a conference room surrounded by executives discussing quarterly efficiency reports. Charts filled the large screen. Waste percentages, distribution costs, disposal compliance. The numbers earned approving nods around the polished table, but Elijah barely heard the conversation. Instead, he kept seeing a rain-soaked woman carefully wiping a single yogurt container before placing it inside a worn canvas bag, as though it were something precious. For reasons he could not explain, every polished graph suddenly felt strangely incomplete. By the time the sun dipped behind Chicago's skyline, the city had traded its afternoon rush for the restless rhythm of evening traffic. Naomi Brooks finished her last grocery delivery with just enough time to pick Micah up from the after-school program before the late pickup fee began. He ran toward her wearing the same oversized backpack that seemed to bounce with every step. "Guess what?" he said, slipping his small hand into hers. "Mrs. Collins said my drawing of the moon is going in the hallway." Naomi smiled as though she had not spent the last 10 minutes wondering whether the gas gauge would survive another day. "I always knew you were an artist." "No," Micah corrected proudly. "An astronaut who draws." "That is even better." They stopped at a neighborhood pharmacy where Naomi quietly checked the price of Micah's asthma prescription before placing it back on the shelf. She still had enough medicine for 2 more days if she measured every dose carefully. "Not today," she whispered to herself. "Tomorrow." On the walk home, they passed a small community park where a little girl stood crying beside an empty swing. Her bright red backpack lay open on the ground, crayons scattered across the sidewalk. Several adults hurried past without slowing down, their attention fixed on phones or bus schedules. Naomi crouched beside the child. "Did something important fall out?" she asked gently. The little girl nodded through tears. "My grandma gave me a silver bracelet, and now it is gone." Naomi glanced toward the grass where the evening light stretched long shadows across the playground. She could have kept walking. She still needed groceries. She still needed gasoline. She still needed to calculate how to stretch $12 through another day. Instead, she knelt in the damp grass with Micah beside her. "We will look together," she said. For nearly 15 minutes, they searched beneath benches, around tree roots, and along the edge of the sidewalk. Finally, Micah pointed beneath the swing. "Mom, I see something shiny." Naomi reached underneath the rubber seat and carefully lifted a delicate silver bracelet tangled around one of the support chains. The little girl's face lit up instantly. She threw her arms around Naomi without saying a word before her grandmother hurried over, breathless with relief. "I cannot thank you enough," the older woman said, pulling a folded $50 bill from her purse. Naomi stepped back with a gentle shake of her head. "Please keep it. Buy her some ice cream instead." The grandmother hesitated. "Are you sure?" Naomi looked toward Micah, who was smiling because someone else's tears had disappeared. "I am sure." They continued walking home as the first streetlights flickered on above them. After a few quiet steps, Micah looked up. "Mom." "Yes." "If we need money so much, why did you not take it?" Naomi squeezed his hand a little tighter. "Because one day someone may have the chance to help you. I want you to know the difference between kindness and debt." Micah thought about her answer for a long moment before nodding with the serious expression only children sometimes carried. Across town, Elijah Carter was leaving a charity board meeting when his executive assistant caught up with him near the lobby elevator. "Before you go," she said, handing him a small incident summary. "One of the hotel managers called earlier. They wanted to recognize a housekeeper who returned a wallet with several $1,000s inside. The guest insisted on rewarding her, but she refused and asked to remain anonymous." Elijah accepted the paper almost absent-mindedly until one sentence caught his attention. "Female employee, single mother, declined financial reward." He stopped walking. "Do they have her name?" His assistant glanced down the page. Naomi Brooks. The name meant nothing to him, but something inside him tightened anyway. Later that night, unable to explain why, Elijah searched the employee directory of the hotel management company that contracted with several of his corporate offices. A staff identification photograph appeared on the screen. The same tired eyes, the same quiet expression, the same woman he had watched through the rain behind the store. Elijah leaned back slowly, surprised by the strange mixture of relief and discomfort that settled over him. She had been given an opportunity to solve at least part of her own hardship, and she had walked away from it without hesitation. For the first time since that rainy evening, he stopped wondering why she had been behind the dumpsters. Instead, he found himself asking a far more difficult question. What kind of system could leave someone that honest believing discarded food was her best option? The following afternoon, the conference room overlooking Lake Michigan was filled with polished confidence, the kind that came from spreadsheets ending in green instead of red. Executives discussed efficiency targets while steaming cups of coffee sat untouched beside expensive leather portfolios. A large screen displayed colorful charts measuring inventory shrink, operating margins, labor costs, and food disposal compliance. Every percentage looked impressive. Every projection pointed upward. Elijah Carter listened in silence, but the numbers no longer carried the certainty they once had. His chief operations officer clicked to the next slide. Store waste is down another 3.7% this quarter. Disposal compliance remains above 99% across all locations. We continue to exceed industry standards. Several board members nodded with quiet satisfaction. Elijah's eyes drifted toward another figure in the corner of the screen. Thousands of pounds of prepared food discarded every week. The number had been there in every quarterly report for years, yet somehow it felt different now. He remembered a woman standing beneath cold rain, gently wiping a single yogurt container before placing it into a worn canvas bag. He remembered how carefully she had held it, as though it were already part of her son's breakfast. Where does all of it go? Elijah asked without looking away from the screen. The room grew unexpectedly quiet. The operations officer answered confidently. Certified disposal facilities. It is the safest legal process. None of it is donated. Some packaged products are, but once prepared food reaches expiration protocols, company policy requires disposal. Liability exposure is too high. The legal counsel leaned forward. One foodborne illness lawsuit could cost millions. The current policy protects both customers and shareholders. Elijah nodded slowly, yet the explanation settled heavily rather than convincingly. Years earlier, he would have accepted that answer without another thought. In fact, he had. Somewhere inside a storage archive sat the document carrying his own signature approving those exact procedures after a consulting firm recommended them as the most efficient solution. At the time, he had been 34 years old, newly appointed chief executive officer, determined to prove that discipline and data mattered more than emotion. Efficiency had become his language because chaos had been his childhood. Few people inside the room knew where he had come from. Long before tailored suits and board meetings, Elijah had shared a one-bedroom apartment with his widowed mother on Chicago's South Side. She worked double shifts at a nursing home while stretching every grocery dollar until it almost disappeared. Some evenings' dinner had been canned soup diluted with extra water, so both of them could pretend there was enough. She used to tell him, no one should have to choose between hunger and dignity. He had carried those words for years. Then success had buried them beneath reports, forecasts, acquisitions, and endless meetings until they became little more than a distant echo. His assistant quietly placed another folder beside him. These are tomorrow's flagship store inspection materials. Elijah opened it absent-mindedly. Inside were photographs of spotless aisles, perfectly stacked produce displays, and freshly baked bread arranged beneath warm lights. Everything looked inviting. Everything looked abundant. Then another page caught his attention. A compliance photograph taken behind the same flagship location. Locked dumpsters, security fencing, disposal logs signed every evening. The image froze him for a brief moment because he recognized the exact corner where Naomi had stood in the rain. The presentation continued around him, but his thoughts had already left the room. Later that evening, he drove himself to the flagship store instead of returning home. He rarely visited without a scheduled appearance, and the evening manager looked pleasantly surprised to see him walking through the aisles wearing nothing more formal than a dark jacket and open-collar shirt. Customers filled shopping carts with fresh vegetables, artisan bread, and prepared meals packaged neatly behind polished glass. Soft music drifted through the speakers, while warm lighting made every display appear comforting. Elijah stopped beside the refrigerated dairy section. Row after row of yogurt cups stretched before him in perfect order. He reached for a vanilla container identical to the one Naomi had carried home. The expiration date showed tomorrow. 24 hours later, if it remained unsold, company policy would send it toward the locked dumpsters outside. He stood there longer than he realized, turning the small container slowly in his hands. The price printed beneath it was $4.99, less than the cost of a specialty coffee. Enough to become breakfast for a child. Enough to become waste according to a policy he himself had approved. For the first time in many years, Elijah no longer wondered whether the system was working exactly as designed. He began to wonder whether he had mistaken efficiency for wisdom, and whether the most expensive decision his company had ever made was one that could never be measured on any quarterly report. The weather turned colder 2 mornings later. carrying the sharp edge of an early November wind that slipped through jacket sleeves and settled into tired bones. Naomi Brooks wrapped Micah's scarf a little tighter before kissing the top of his head outside school. "Remember your inhaler if you have recess today," she reminded him gently. Micah patted the pocket of his backpack with a confident smile. "I will. And I am going to finish my rocket today." She watched him disappear through the school doors before glancing at the nearly empty fuel gauge in her Honda. The warning light had been glowing since yesterday afternoon. She calculated the miles in her head the way other people calculated vacation days. If she skipped lunch again, accepted 2 extra delivery orders, and prayed gas prices did not rise overnight, she could probably make it until Friday. That afternoon, after finishing another housekeeping shift, Naomi stopped outside the pharmacy once again. She stood quietly in front of the prescription counter, studying the refill cost for Micah's inhaler before placing the receipt back into her pocket. The pharmacist offered a sympathetic smile. "We can hold it another day if that helps." Naomi nodded gratefully. "Thank you." She hated those words because they usually meant she could not say yes to something her son needed. As evening settled over the city, she drove toward the Whole Foods parking lot with only one grocery delivery left on her phone. The order was canceled halfway there. Her screen displayed the notification, followed immediately by another message from the delivery app informing her that no additional orders were available nearby. She sat quietly behind the steering wheel, listening to the heater blow air that was no longer warm. Home was only 15 minutes away, but her refrigerator contained little more than mustard, half a loaf of bread, and a carton of milk that would not last another morning. She closed her eyes for a moment before starting the engine again. The service alley behind the store looked almost identical to the night Elijah had first seen her. The same security lights, the same humming refrigeration units, the same locked dumpsters lined neatly against the brick wall. Naomi waited until the employees disappeared inside before approaching carefully. She was reaching toward the lid when a firm but not hostile voice interrupted the silence. "Ma'am, you cannot be back here." She turned immediately. A middle-aged security guard stood several feet away, his flashlight pointed toward the ground rather than her face. His expression carried more discomfort than anger. Naomi stepped back at once. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "I was leaving." The guard sighed. "I know people come back here sometimes. I do not enjoy chasing anyone away, but there are cameras everywhere. If I ignore it, I lose my job." Naomi nodded because she understood exactly what it meant to protect a paycheck. "I understand." Just as she turned to leave, the back service door opened. A grocery employee rolled out a cart stacked with sealed containers labeled for disposal. Salads, sandwiches, fruit cups, yogurt. Everything looked untouched. The employee locked the dumpster after emptying the cart and disappeared inside without looking up. Naomi's eyes rested for only a second on another familiar vanilla yogurt container before the heavy lid slammed shut. She never reached for it. The guard noticed. "Most of that food was made this morning," he muttered almost to himself. "Company policy." Before Naomi could answer, headlights swept across the alley. A black SUV turned the corner and stopped near the loading dock. Elijah Carter stepped out before the driver could open his door. He had come unannounced to observe the evening disposal process with his own eyes after reviewing compliance reports all afternoon. Instead, he walked directly into a moment no spreadsheet had ever captured. He saw Naomi standing silently a few feet from the locked dumpster. He saw the security guard looking embarrassed instead of suspicious. He saw the sealed containers disappear behind steel because a policy demanded it. Neither Naomi nor the guard recognized him immediately. Elijah remained still, watching the quiet exchange unfold. "I really am sorry," Naomi said to the guard once more. "You are only doing your job." The guard lowered his flashlight. "And maybe you are only trying to do yours." Those simple words landed harder than any presentation Elijah had heard in the boardroom. He looked from the locked dumpster to the woman who had apologized for asking nothing from anyone except the chance to bring home food that would never reach another customer. Then his eyes settled on the disposal log clipped beside the loading dock. At the bottom of the page, beneath the printed policy number, was the authorization signature that had been reproduced thousands of times across every store in the company. His own name stared back at him in neat black ink. For the first time, the distance between a decision made in an executive office and the life of a single mother standing in a cold alley no longer felt theoretical. It measured only a few feet, yet it was the longest distance he had ever failed to see. The cold lingered long after Naomi Brooks drove away from the service alley that evening. She kept both hands on the steering wheel, not because the streets were difficult, but because they were trembling just enough for her to notice. The security guard had not humiliated her. He had spoken with kindness that carried its own quiet sadness. Somehow that made everything hurt a little more. She reached her apartment building just before 8 o'clock. The hallway smelled faintly of old paint and laundry detergent, familiar enough to feel like home despite the peeling walls. Micah was sitting at the small kitchen table, finishing his science worksheet beneath the yellow glow of a lamp that flickered every few minutes. "Mom," he said excitedly, holding up his paper. "Mrs. Collins put a gold star on my rocket drawing." Naomi smiled as she took off her coat. "I knew she would." She prepared grilled cheese sandwiches from the last slices of bread and carefully divided the remaining milk between 2 glasses, giving Micah the larger one without saying a word. While he talked happily about planets and astronauts, she quietly calculated the next 3 days in her mind. Rent, gasoline, the inhaler waiting at the pharmacy. The numbers refused to fit together no matter how many times she rearranged them. Across the city, Elijah Carter sat alone inside his office long after everyone else had gone home. The disposal log from the loading dock remained open on his desk beside a copy of the policy manual carrying his signature. For years, he had believed responsible leadership meant removing emotion from difficult decisions. Tonight, that belief no longer felt like wisdom. It felt like distance. Early the next morning, he called an emergency meeting with the heads of operations, legal affairs, food safety, and community partnerships. The conference room filled quickly, concern replacing routine when everyone realized the chief executive officer himself had requested the meeting before business hours. Elijah placed a sealed yogurt container in the center of the polished table. No presentation, no slides, just the small cup. "I want to discuss our food disposal policy," he said calmly. The operations director exchanged a puzzled glance with legal counsel. "Has there been a compliance issue?" Elijah shook his head. "No. I am asking whether we can safely donate more prepared food before it becomes waste." The legal counsel answered almost immediately. "The liability exposure remains substantial. We reviewed this years ago." Another executive added, "Changing procedures across every location would increase labor costs, transportation expenses, insurance premiums, and compliance oversight. Shareholders will not support it." Elijah listened quietly before asking a simple question. "Have any of you personally watched the food being thrown away?" Silence settled over the room. Finally, the operations director replied, "That is not really the point." Elijah looked at him steadily. "I think it might be exactly the point." The meeting stretched for nearly 2 hours. Every proposal met another obstacle. Insurance, state regulations, distribution logistics, public relations risk, existing vendor contracts. Each answer sounded reasonable on its own, yet together they formed a wall so solid that no one inside seemed capable of imagining another way. When the meeting ended, nothing had changed except Elijah's understanding of how deeply the system resisted changing itself. Meanwhile, Naomi arrived at the Lakeshore Grand Hotel only to find her supervisor waiting near the employee entrance with an uncomfortable expression. "Naomi, can we talk for a minute?" She immediately felt the familiar tightening in her chest that accompanied bad news. The supervisor held up a printed photograph taken from a cell phone screen. It showed a woman standing beside a locked dumpster behind a grocery store. The image was grainy, captured from a distance, but Naomi recognized her own coat instantly. "One of our guests shared this online after recognizing you from the hotel," the supervisor said gently. "It has been circulating since last night." Naomi lowered her eyes without reaching for the paper. "I understand. You have always been one of our most dependable employees." He hesitated before continuing. "But management believes the attention could affect the hotel's reputation. Human Resources wants to place you on unpaid leave while they review the situation." The words landed softly, almost politely, yet they carried the weight of another door quietly closing. Naomi did not argue. She did not cry. She simply removed her employee name badge, placed it carefully on the supervisor's desk, and thanked him for giving her a chance when she had first applied 2 years earlier. As she stepped back onto the sidewalk, the autumn wind swept dry leaves across the parking lot. Her phone buzzed almost immediately with another reminder from the pharmacy that Micah's inhaler refill would be returned to inventory by the end of the day if it remained unclaimed. Naomi looked toward the gray sky above the city, took one slow breath, and began walking toward her car. She had just lost the job that kept her family afloat, while several miles away the man who wanted to change everything was discovering that the greatest obstacle was not one policy or one signature, but an entire system determined to protect itself before protecting the people it was meant to serve. Naomi waited until she reached the parking lot before allowing herself to stop walking. The wind carried the scent of rain across the empty pavement, rustling a handful of brown leaves around the tires of her aging Honda. She climbed into the driver's seat, closed the door, and rested both hands against the steering wheel. For a long moment, she simply listened to the silence inside the car. No phone calls, no traffic, no voices asking anything from her. Only the quiet awareness that she no longer had a job to return to tomorrow. Then her phone vibrated. The screen showed the pharmacy's number. Naomi answered immediately. "Mrs. Brooks, this is only a reminder," the pharmacist said kindly. "Your son's inhaler prescription will be returned to stock at closing time today unless it is picked up." Naomi swallowed carefully. "Could you please hold it until tomorrow morning?" There was a brief pause. "I will do my best. Thank you." She ended the call and closed her eyes. She had promised Micah that breathing would never become something he had to worry about. Somehow she had to keep that promise. Across the city, Elijah Carter stared through another conference room window while members of the executive committee debated legal exposure for what felt like the 100th time. Every solution he proposed was answered with another reason it could not happen. Every concern for people returned to percentages, insurance tables, or shareholder expectations. Finally, the chairman of the board folded his hands together. "Elijah, your compassion is admirable, but one isolated incident should not drive company-wide policy." Elijah looked up slowly. "You think this is one isolated incident?" Nobody answered. The chairman continued in a measured voice. "If you wish to help that particular woman, do it privately. Create a hardship grant. Pay her rent. Offer her employment. Those are personal choices. Changing an entire operating system is something very different." The meeting ended without a single vote in his favor. Yet one sentence continued echoing in his mind. "Help that particular woman." That afternoon, Elijah asked his assistant to locate Naomi Brooks. She hesitated only long enough to explain that public records listed the apartment where she lived. "I do not want to invade her privacy," Elijah replied quietly. "I only want to apologize." Just before sunset, a black SUV stopped outside Naomi's apartment building. Elijah stepped out alone, carrying 2 paper grocery bags filled with fresh food and another small envelope containing a prepaid pharmacy card. He climbed the narrow staircase himself and knocked gently on apartment 3B. A few seconds later, the door opened. Naomi looked surprised, but not frightened. She recognized him immediately from business magazines displayed near the hotel lobby where she had worked. She also recognized the logo on the grocery bags. Elijah spoke first. "My name is Elijah Carter." Naomi nodded politely. "I know who you are." He glanced at the floor before meeting her eyes again. "I owe you an apology." She waited quietly. "I saw what happened behind the store several nights ago. I also know you lost your job today." Naomi's expression remained calm, though the muscles around her eyes tightened almost imperceptibly. Elijah held out the grocery bags. "Please let me help." She looked past him toward the hallway, making certain Micah could not hear the conversation from the kitchen. Then she stepped outside and gently pulled the apartment door almost closed behind her. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, "do you know what embarrassed me most that night?" Elijah shook his head. "It was not being hungry. It was hoping nobody would see me." Her words settled heavily between them. He extended the grocery bags once more. "Then let me make this right." Naomi looked at the bags for several long seconds before carefully pushing them back toward him. "You cannot." Elijah frowned slightly. "I can at least make sure you and your son have food." "For how long?" she asked quietly. "A week? A month?" He hesitated. Naomi continued before he could answer. "There are mothers standing behind other stores tonight. Fathers too. Grandparents. Students. Veterans. People you will never meet." Her voice never rose. She never sounded angry. She simply sounded tired in a way that reached much deeper than exhaustion. "If tomorrow another mother has to stand where I stood, then I am not the person who needs saving. Elijah found himself unable to respond. Naomi placed one gentle hand on the grocery bag before letting it go again. Kindness that only reaches one person is beautiful, she said. Responsibility reaches everyone else. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Somewhere down the hallway, a child laughed behind another apartment door. A washing machine hummed faintly through the wall. Ordinary sounds filled the silence between extraordinary words. Elijah slowly lowered the grocery bags. He had arrived believing generosity could repair what guilt had exposed. Instead, a woman who had almost nothing had quietly shown him the difference between charity and accountability. As he turned to leave, Naomi spoke one final sentence that followed him all the way back down the staircase. Do not change my life because you saw me. Change the system because now you cannot unsee everyone else. The following Monday morning, the boardroom felt colder than the November air outside. No one spoke while Elijah Carter walked to the head of the long walnut table carrying a single cardboard box instead of the usual stack of reports. Inside the box were sealed sandwiches, salads, fruit cups, and several containers of vanilla yogurt collected from one flagship store before they reached the dumpster. He placed the box gently in the center of the table. The room filled with puzzled expressions. This, Elijah said quietly, was scheduled to become trash last night. The chief financial officer adjusted his glasses. We have already discussed the legal concerns. Elijah nodded. Today we are discussing responsibility. He pressed a button on the remote beside him. The screen behind him did not display profit projections. Instead, it showed photographs from stores across the company. Locked dumpsters, disposal logs, perfectly sealed meals stacked inside garbage bins. Then came the final image. A close photograph of the policy authorization bearing his own signature. Elijah did not hide it. He left it on the screen for everyone to see. I approve this, he said. Nobody else. I did. The room remained silent. I believed efficiency meant doing the least risky thing. I was wrong. We built a system that protects food better than it protects people. The chairman leaned forward. Changing national policy without full board approval would expose this company to enormous financial risk. Elijah met his gaze calmly. Then let the vote reflect that risk. Legal counsel spoke next. Insurance carriers may refuse coverage. Then we negotiate. The operations director added, hundreds of stores will require new logistics. Then we build them. Another executive sighed. Shareholders will not appreciate declining margins. Elijah looked around the table before answering. If the only way to preserve our margins is to throw away meals while families search behind our stores, then we have misunderstood what success costs. By noon, the debate had become the longest board meeting in company history. Finally, the chairman placed a formal motion on the table. Elijah's proposal could move forward only if he accepted full executive responsibility for every financial consequence during the first year. If losses exceeded projections, the board reserved the right to remove him as chief executive officer. Several directors expected him to hesitate. Instead, Elijah signed the resolution before anyone finished speaking. His pen never paused. If someone has to pay the price, he said, sliding the document back across the table, it should be the person who signed the original policy. 3 days later, trucks carrying new refrigeration equipment began arriving at pilot locations across Chicago. Community food banks partnered with store managers. New safety procedures were written with food banks, health inspectors, and local charities sitting at the same table instead of receiving instructions afterward. The work was slower than Elijah had imagined. Every solution uncovered another practical problem. Pickup schedules, temperature monitoring, volunteer coordination. Nothing changed overnight. That was exactly why it finally felt real. During the same week, Naomi received an unexpected phone call from a neighborhood nonprofit that worked with local food distribution programs. One of the directors had heard about her experience and asked whether she would attend a planning meeting to describe what families actually faced. Naomi hesitated before accepting. She arrived wearing the same navy sweater she had worn to countless job interviews. When she entered the conference room, she stopped in surprise. Elijah was already there, seated among volunteers, warehouse managers, nutrition specialists, and church coordinators. There was no reserved chair at the head of the table. No presentation waiting for applause. He stood as she entered, but said nothing. Instead, he quietly pulled out an empty chair. Throughout the meeting, Naomi spoke more than anyone expected. She explained why pickup hours mattered to parents working two jobs. She described how embarrassment kept many families away from food pantries. She suggested smaller neighborhood refrigerators because not everyone owned reliable transportation. Nobody interrupted her. People took notes. Elijah wrote more than anyone else. At one point, a logistics consultant suggested requiring extensive income verification before families received assistance. Naomi gently shook her head. Hunger already asks enough questions, she said. We do not need to ask more before offering dinner. The room fell thoughtfully quiet. Elijah crossed out an entire page of notes and started again. When the meeting ended, the first draft of the program looked very different from the one his executives had originally designed. It was no longer built around protecting procedures. It was built around protecting dignity. As Naomi stepped outside into the crisp afternoon sunlight, she noticed volunteers unloading insulated containers from a delivery truck. One young volunteer carefully lifted a box marked dairy. Inside sat dozens of sealed vanilla yogurt cups waiting to be delivered to neighborhood refrigerators before the end of the day. Naomi paused for only a moment before smiling softly. For the first time since that rainy night behind the store, she did not see discarded food. She saw the beginning of a promise finally learning how to keep itself. 1 year later, spring sunlight poured through the wide front windows of the neighborhood community food hub, replacing the cold gray memories that had once defined so many evenings. Children laughed near the entrance while volunteers stocked fresh produce, bread, dairy products, and prepared meals into neatly organized refrigerators. There were no questions asked before someone reached for food. No forms that turned hunger into paperwork. No locked gates separating dignity from survival. A small wooden sign near the entrance read, "Take what you need. Leave what you can." Naomi Brooks paused just inside the doorway, balancing a crate of yogurt containers against her hip. She had accepted a full-time position months earlier helping coordinate neighborhood food partnerships across Chicago, drawing on the experiences she once wished she had never lived through. Her days were still busy. Bills still arrived every month. Life had not become perfect, but it had become steady enough that she could finally make plans further ahead than next Friday. Across the room, 9-year-old Micah carefully arranged vanilla yogurt cups inside a refrigerated shelf with the same concentration he once reserved for building paper rockets. He adjusted each container until every label faced forward. "Mom," he called with a grin. "These look better when they are straight." Naomi smiled warmly. "Your grandmother would agree with that." He laughed before reaching for another carton. Watching him, Naomi found herself remembering a rainy night behind a locked dumpster, when one small yogurt cup had felt impossibly valuable because it represented breakfast, hope, and one more day she could keep her promise to her son. The memory no longer carried shame. It carried purpose. The front door opened, and Elijah Carter stepped quietly inside, carrying no cameras, no reporters, and no entourage. He wore a simple navy jacket instead of the tailored suits that once seemed like another layer between him and the people his decisions affected. The company had endured a difficult year. Operating costs had increased. Several investors had sold their shares. Headlines questioned whether the new food recovery initiative was financially wise. 6 months earlier, the board had reduced Elijah's compensation after the transition costs exceeded initial projections. He had accepted every consequence without appeal because none of them compared to the cost someone else had been paying before. Yet something unexpected had happened as well. Store waste had fallen dramatically. Community partnerships had strengthened customer trust. Employee volunteer programs had flourished beyond anyone's forecasts. Other grocery chains had quietly begun adopting similar systems after watching the results. The world had not transformed overnight, but a few more lights had appeared where darkness once seemed permanent. Elijah walked toward the dairy refrigerator just as Micah finished placing the final vanilla yogurt on the shelf. "Looks like you have everything under control," Elijah said with a gentle smile. Micah looked up proudly. "Mom says if you are going to help people, you should do the little things carefully." Elijah nodded. "Your mom has taught me that too." Naomi joined them a moment later. For a few seconds, none of them spoke. The quiet felt comfortable now, no longer filled with guilt or uncertainty. Elijah glanced toward the refrigerator. "Do you know," he said softly, "I used to think leadership meant always having the right answers. Naomi looked at the rows of fresh food before replying. Sometimes it just means listening long enough to hear the right question. Elijah smiled, recognizing the truth in her words. Across the room, another family entered the food hub. A tired father picked up fresh fruit while his daughter reached excitedly for a carton of milk. No one stared. No one whispered. They simply welcomed them with the same quiet respect every neighbor deserved. Micah closed the refrigerator door gently and stepped back to admire his work. The neat row of vanilla yogurt reflected softly through the glass beneath the warm afternoon light. Naomi rested a hand on his shoulder, and for a brief moment, she saw two versions of the same child in her heart. One had waited patiently at a small kitchen table for whatever breakfast his mother could somehow find. The other stood confidently helping make sure another child would never have to wonder where breakfast was coming from. As the sunlight settled across the room, Elijah realized that the most important thing his company had rescued was never the food itself. It was the quiet belief that no person should have to lose their dignity before receiving kindness. And somewhere beyond the windows, the city continued moving as it always had, but for countless families, one locked dumpster had quietly become an open door.